Okay, let's unpack this. For years, you and I, well, everyone really, has heard the U.S. China trade war talked about in, frankly, the most tedious terms possible.
Oh, yeah. Tariffs,
Yeah.
duties, these endless talks about market access.
Exactly. It just sounded like, background noise in the global economy, something that was always there, frustrating, but maybe not.
Hmm.
Fundamentally changing things.
But I think the sources we've been digging into, they paint a really different picture now. This conflict, it's moved. It's in a completely different league.
Right.
It's not just a trade skirmish anymore. It seems to have quietly, maybe not so quietly now, but strategically, deliberately transformed.
Yeah.
It's become a confrontation fought with industrial policy and supply chains.
Not soldiers.
Not soldiers. It's a new kind of warfare, really.
And it's a fight that's rooted in, well, probably the oldest geopolitical problem we know. We're seeing what a lot of people are calling the Thucydides Trap playing out right now.
Hmm.
But instead of ancient Greek warships, the weapons are economic tools. And this shift, it seems to be escalating fast, pushing both sides into this really precarious state. A state defined by, I like this phrase, mutually assured disruption.
Mutually assured disruption. Yeah, that's a striking way to put it. And it captures the paradox perfectly, doesn't it?
It does.
Because the conflict, now it's symmetrical in a way, but the actual points of attack are completely different ends of the spectrum.
Right. So Washington is blocking the top end, the really sophisticated stuff. We're talking advanced semiconductors, AI chips.
The crown jewels of tech, essentially, trying to put a ceiling on China's technological climb.
And Beijing, they deliver the counterpunch by blocking the absolute base layer, the foundational stuff.
Exactly. The critical minerals, the rare earths that, well, frankly, those advanced ships need to even exist and that modern militaries absolutely depend on.
So our mission today, for you listening, is to take you deep into this transformation. We want to explore how that ancient Thucydides analogy actually applies to this new economic battlefield.
And we need to get into the incredible technical details, the dependencies, and also the legal complexities that this whole thing is kicking up right here in the U.S.
It's a lot to cover.
Yeah.
Okay, so it feels almost impossible to talk about this rivalry, this escalation, without bringing up Thucydides. Maybe help us map out how that ancient historian's idea helps us understand today's battlefield, beyond just the simple rising power meets established power thing.
Right. Well, the original concept, it comes from Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War. And it's simple on the surface, but devastatingly profound. He argued the war between Sparta and Athens was, and this is the famous quote, unavoidable because of the rise of Athens and the fear that this instilled in Sparta.
Fear. That's the key word.
It really is. It wasn't about a single insult or border dispute necessarily. It was about the structural tension that builds up when a rising power that was Athens, dynamic, commercial, ambitious, starts to really challenge this stability, the dominance of the established power, Sparta, traditional, militaristic, and really anxious about keeping things the way they were.
And it's almost a perfect map onto today's situation, isn't it? The U.S. is Sparta, the established rule setter, deeply worried about losing its edge, especially in tech and finance. And China is Athens, rising fast, assertive, commercially aggressive, demanding, a bigger seat at the global table.
It fits frighteningly well. But here's the absolutely critical difference from ancient Greece. There can't be a direct hot war, a kinetic war.
Because nukes?
Because of nuclear deterrence, absolutely. The risk of escalation is just unthinkable. It's mutually assured destruction in the old sense. But also critically, because our economies are so deeply tangled up. Global supply chains are incredibly interwoven. I mean, China is a massive trading partner for the U.S. in so many vital sectors, and vice versa. A direct military fight would just annihilate the very prosperity and global system both sides are competing to lead.
So, okay, no missiles, no ships clashing on the high seas. The conflict has to be fought differently.
It has to be. It becomes this prolonged systemic competition fought with economic and technological policy. It's a struggle for control over you could call it the global operating system, meaning supply chains, tech standards, who dominates in currency, who controls data flows. That's the terrain now.
And this brings us to the idea that this isn't just happening by accident. This is deliberate strategy now.
Exactly. That's a key shift. If you look back at the earlier trade friction, say the start of the tariff wars under Trump, a lot of it felt reactive, tit-for-tat tariff.
Yeah, almost impulsive sometimes.
Right. But this current phase, it feels much more defined by deliberate, calculated, long-term strategic moves, especially, it seems, from Beijing's side.
And the sources we looked at suggest That Beijing's calculus here, it isn't just about flexing muscles internationally. It's actually being driven by some pretty serious pressures at home. What's happening inside China that's pushing them to use economic leverage so aggressively now?
That's a really crucial piece of the puzzle and often overlooked. Beijing is facing some major domestic headwinds right now.
Like the demographic crunch we hear about.
That's a big one, yes.
Right.
A rapidly worsening demographic slowdown, the workforce shrinking relative to the aging population, and also a deep, ongoing crisis in their huge real estate sector, which has knock-on effects in finance.
So the internal growth engine isn't firing on all cylinders like it used to.
Exactly. And those issues, they really constrain the government's ability to just rely on explosive internal growth to keep everyone happy and maintain stability and legitimacy the way they did for decades.
So if you can't guarantee that same level of, ever-increasing prosperity at home,
You need to generate leverage somewhere else. You pivot. They seem to be strategically constrained by their own slowdown, so they use these targeted, often asymmetric economic pressure points, like controlling critical materials to reassert their geopolitical standing, and perhaps also to distract a bit from domestic uncertainties.
it's like a controlled valve release. Show strength abroad, shore up support at home.
Precisely. It sends a message to Washington, and it sends a message internally, too.
Which means that old dividing line between, say, trade policy and national security policy,
Yeah,
it's just gone, completely evaporated.
it's totally gone. We are absolutely seeing Clausewitz's old line, war by other means, play out in real time.
Yeah,
The sources are really clear on this. Economic tools, tariffs, sure, but more pointedly, export controls, investment restrictions, and especially the bans on advanced chips, these are now explicit instruments of deterrence. They're strategic weapons, full stop.
so the front lines in this new kind of war, they aren't lines on a map. They're abstract.
They are. They're digital, they're financial, they're even psychological. Instead of, invading physical territory, the rivals are invading markets, restricting access to capital, blocking the flow of crucial technology like high-end chips, and weaponizing data flows.
And this fight forces both sides to just accept economic pain inflation, shortages as the price of competing.
It seems so. It's the necessary cost of strategic competition in this new era. And for Beijing specifically, this kind of calculated confrontation, it actually serves multiple internal purposes.
Okay, like what?
Well, first, it definitely helps strengthen domestic legitimacy. They can frame China as the victim of, aggressive U.S. containment efforts. That rallies nationalist feelings, which is useful when the economy feels uncertain.
Right, the rally around the flag effect.
Exactly. But it also does something else, perhaps more strategic.
Which is?
It forces them to accelerate their own long-term goals. It acts as an accelerator. Well, it compels Beijing to speed up strategic diversification. That means deepening trade and financial links with the global south. You hear about this rare earth belt and road idea, and actively trying to hedge against the dominance of the U.S. dollar, using other payment systems, trading in local currencies.
And the big irony, the U.S. actions meant to cripple Chinese tech.
Ha! Yes, the biggest irony of all. The U.S. trade war, particularly the chip restrictions, it's unintentionally acted like a massive state-funded incubator for Chinese self-reliance.
It forces their hand.
It absolutely forces them into a national sprint towards making their own chips, their own advanced EVs, their own AI platforms. If the U.S. cuts off the supply of advanced chips, well, China feels it has no choice but to pour trillions of yuan into building its own capacity from the ground up.
So even if the West builds walls, China wants to ensure it can still operate inside those walls, technologically speaking.
That seems to be the goal. They're essentially signaling, okay, if this confrontation is coming, maybe we prefer to have it now, while our leverage over these foundational industrial materials is still absolutely critical to the West.
Okay, let's dig into that symmetry you mentioned, because it really seems to define the current situation. It makes it so delicate. Let's break down the two big choke points, starting with the U.S. strategy hitting the high end.
Right. Washington's strategy has been very precise, laser-focused, really, on advanced semiconductors. Specifically, the chips themselves, but also the incredibly complex equipment needed to manufacture them.
And the goal is pretty blunt, isn't it?
Oh, it's straightforward. Slow down China's climb up the tech ladder, particularly when it comes to those cutting-edge nodes, chips smaller than, say, 7 nanometers.
Why those specifically?
Because those are the chips essential for training the really large, powerful AI models. And crucially, from a security perspective, they power advanced military command and control systems, surveillance, that sort of thing.
So the export controls aren't just on the finished chips, it's the whole ecosystem.
It's the whole ecosystem. It targets the design software, the specialized manufacturing tools, even, in some cases, the movement of skilled personnel who could transfer that know-how.
Like those super advanced lithography machines we hear about.
Yeah.
EUV.
Exactly. The control list is broad, but the real centerpiece is restricting access to extreme ultraviolet, UV, and the most advanced deep ultraviolet, DUV, lithography machines. These are mostly made by one company, the Dutch firm ASML.
And they are the absolute bottleneck for making modern chips.
They are the bottleneck. By denying or severely restricting China's access to these machines, the U.S. aims to effectively lock China into older generations of computing power. The strategic goal is to stall their military modernization and blunt their ambitions for global leadership in AI.
Okay, so the U.S. tightens that screw on the high-tech end.
And almost immediately, China responds with its own precise foundational countermove.
Not with tariffs, but with something more targeted.
Much more targeted. Beijing rolled out these sweeping new export controls. And they didn't target luxury goods or soybeans. They targeted materials absolutely essential for the very sectors the U.S. is trying to protect and advance its military and its green energy transition.
Gallium, germanium.
Gallium and germanium, yes, used in specialized semiconductors, high-frequency communications, radar systems. Also, significantly, certain types of graphite needed for EV batteries. And the big one, specific rare earth elements.
This really backs up that analysis from Dr. Maria Santos you mentioned earlier from the source material.
It absolutely does. Dr. Santos nailed symmetry. The U.S. went high in blocking chips. China went low in blocking minerals.
Both essential.
Both absolutely essential. And both moves, as she pointed out, show really exquisite strategic targeting. The chip restrictions aim at China's future tech potential. The mineral restrictions threaten America's present industrial and military capacity.
Let's get specific about those minerals. What exactly does blocking access to these particular materials do to the U.S. industrial base? What can't they build?
Okay, so the elements they targeted, things like neodymium, dysprosium, terbium, they are absolutely vital for making extremely powerful, but also lightweight permanent magnets.
The super strong magnets.
The super strong magnets. And these aren't just in your headphones. They are critical across all high-performance defense systems and increasingly clean energy tech.
So if you can't reliably get these materials,
You can't build things like precision-guided missiles. You can't build advanced fighter jets with their complex sensors and controls. You can't build the high-torque motors needed for most electric vehicles. It hits right at the heart of advanced manufacturing.
and the timing of this countermove, it feels like it carries a message beyond just the U.S. China trade fight.
Oh, it certainly seems calculated that way. The sources definitely highlight that this escalation is happening right when there's intense pressure from the West on China about its, let's say, indirect support for Russia's war effort in Ukraine, sending dual-use tech, buying Russian oil.
So China demonstrates it can squeeze the West's own military production.
Exactly. By showing they can constrain U.S. access to these fundamental materials, China signals very clearly that it holds a powerful lever, a lever that can influence the pace, and critically, the cost of any major global conflict the U.S. might get involved in.
It's a strategic squeeze play.
Mm-hmm.
The U.S. is juggling commitments, arming Ukraine, deterring conflict in the Pacific.
Right.
And if China can just raise the cost or slow down the delivery of the basic materials needed for U.S. weapon systems and advanced components.
It directly undermines America's ability to act as that global security backstop. It makes projecting power more expensive and more difficult.
This really is the definition of weaponized interdependence, isn't it?
It absolutely is. The very infrastructure of global commerce, these shared supply chains that were supposed to bring peace and efficiency, they're now the main battlefield.
Yeah.
Both powers are using that mutual dependence as a tool for coercion, for deterrence. It creates the situation where any really severe move against the other side almost automatically triggers an industrial headache or even a crisis back home.
Okay, let's spend some serious time on rare earth elements, because I think for most people, they hear the name and think, okay, they're rare. But that name is probably one of the biggest misnomers in science.
It is completely misleading. They are not geologically rare at all. They're actually found pretty widely across the Earth's crust. As one analyst we read, James Holloway from MIT, points out really clearly, the problem isn't scarcity. It's the difficulty and, frankly, the toxicity involved in refining them into usable metals.
Okay, unpack that refining process for us. Why is it so hard? And how did China end up dominating it so completely? Why is it so tough for the West to get back in the game?
Well, China built its dominance basically by being willing to do the really hard, dirty, and environmentally damaging work that other countries, particularly the U.S., decided wasn't worth the cost or the environmental headache.
How does it work?
Okay, so when you mine rare earth ores, they come out of the ground all mixed together with each other and other minerals. To separate them into the 17 individual elements, lanthanum, cerium, neodymium, all those names down the periodic table, you need complex chemical processes. Originally, it was fractional crystallization, but now it's mostly solvent extraction.
Solvent extraction.
Yeah.
Sounds technical.
It is, but the key thing is it's incredibly resource intensive and generates a huge amount of toxic waste.
How so?
It uses vast quantities of really corrosive acids and chemical solvents, plus tons of water. The whole process is long, it takes a lot of energy, and the byproduct is massive amounts of waste material tailings and wastewater that are often mildly radioactive and contaminated with heavy metals.
Yikes.
So back in the 1980s and 90s, as Western countries, especially the U.S., started tightening up environmental regulations, things like the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, the cost of doing this kind of processing domestically skyrocketed because you had to account for safe disposal and cleanup.
And China saw an opportunity.
China stepped right in. With heavy state subsidies, much looser environmental enforcement at the time, and lower labor costs, they basically said, we'll do this difficult, dirty work, and they cornered the market.
And the result today is just staggering dominance, isn't it?
It's incredible. Today, China refines something like 85%, maybe even more, of the world's rare earths. Even though they only hold about a third of the actual geological reserves, their dominance isn't in the ground. It's purely industrial. It's the factories, the processing capacity, and crucially, the accumulated know-how.
So when the world decided to go green, it inadvertently made itself dependent on China's industrial capacity.
That's exactly what happened. Holloway, the analyst I mentioned, called it building the renewable future on a fragile foundation, because the energy transition relies heavily on technologies that need these elements.
Okay, let's talk applications. Clean tech first. Where are rare earths absolutely indispensable?
Right. They are literally at the heart of the energy transition. Neodymium, often combined with other elements like dysprosium, which helps the magnet keep its strength at high temperatures, is essential for those high-performance permanent magnets.
The super strong ones again.
Yes, and those magnets are what drive the traction motors in most electric vehicles. They're also critical for the generators in large wind turbines, especially offshore ones. Without these specific rare earth magnets, EV range and performance would drop significantly, and renewable energy generation becomes much less efficient.
Okay, that's the green tech side. Now the part that really sets off geopolitical alarm bells. Defense dependency. Which specific military systems are basically paralyzed if the supply of rare earths gets choked off?
This is where the vulnerability is maybe most acute, most immediate. Because in many high-performance military applications, these elements are effectively non-substitutable. There just aren't other materials that can do the same job with the same performance, size, and weight constraints.
Like what kind of systems?
They're critical in precision-guided munitions, PGMs. Think javelin missiles, smart bombs. They're essential for advanced radar systems, for infrared sensors used in targeting and night vision, and for countless specialized components in aircraft and ships that need extreme stability or magnetic properties.
And that F-35 fighter jet example we saw in the sources, that really drives the point home.
It really does. Just one F-35 jet, the absolute pinnacle of U.S. air power, requires 417 kilograms of rare earth elements.
Wow.
That's nearly half a ton per plane. For things like its flight control actuators, its sophisticated electronic warfare systems, specialized magnets in its engine components. And it's not just jets. Virginia-class submarines, the backbone of the U.S. undersea fleet, need rare earths for their quiet electric propulsion systems and their highly sensitive sonar arrays. The entire high-tech edge of the U.S. military runs on materials refined primarily in China.
That quote from the retired Colonel Michael Harrington, it just captured the strategic threat perfectly. He said, if you want to slow down America's war machine without firing a missile, this is how you do it.
Exactly. China doesn't even need to impose a total embargo, which might trigger a massive crisis. They just need to introduce uncertainty, delay shipments, reduce quotas slightly.
Create friction.
Great friction. Even a temporary squeeze, say, cutting supply by 20% for 6 months could potentially stall production lines for critical munitions like javelin missiles or precision artillery shells, or slow down the delivery of new F-35s. That kind of leverage is immense, especially when the U.S. is trying to keep supply lines running to support allies in places like Ukraine or maintain deterrence in Asia.
And this highlights that absurd situation, the catch-22, with U.S. supply chains. We actually have a major rare earth mine in the U.S., Mountain Pass in California, but even it hasn't been able to fully escape this dependency loop.
Yeah, Mountain Pass is the perfect illustration of where the real bottleneck lies. It's operated by a company called MP Materials, and it's one of the biggest, richest rare earth deposits outside China. But for years, even after they restarted mining, the concentrated rare earth or they dug up often had to be shipped to China for the final, complex separation and refining steps.
Why? We have the ore here.
Because the U.S. simply lacked the necessary processing infrastructure. And maybe even more critically, it lacked the workforce with the specific technical expertise, the specialized metallurgists, the chemical engineers, because that entire industry had been offshored for decades. The skills atrophy.
So let me get this straight. America digs the raw stuff out of the ground in California, ships it to China, where they do the difficult, toxic, but essential value-add step.
Right, the refining and separation into individual elements.
And then the finished high-purity oxides, or maybe even the magnets made from them, get shipped back to the U.S.
Often.
to be put into our most advanced, most sensitive defense systems.
It sounds crazy when you lay it out like that, but that has been the reality. It's a stark indictment of, well, short-sighted industrial strategy over the past 30 years, focused purely on cost without considering resilience.
So China's strategic move with these export controls, it feels fundamentally aimed at just raising the cost, financial, logistical, strategic of America, maintaining its global power position.
That seems to be the core objective. By threatening the smooth, continuous supply of these foundational materials, they inject this paralyzing uncertainty into the whole logistics chain supporting U.S. global commitments. It makes everything harder, slower, and more expensive.
Okay, so while this big geopolitical chess match is playing out chips versus minerals, this whole confrontation is starting to have some really serious consequences back home, particularly when it comes to inflation and now legal challenges here in the U.S.
Yeah, the domestic angle is becoming impossible to ignore, and the irony, especially around the tariffs, is just inescapable.
How so?
Well, remember, the tariffs were initially sold as this tool to punish China, right?
Yeah.
And also to protect fledgling U.S. industries, bring manufacturing back home.
Right, America First manufacturing.
Exactly. But in practice, how they actually function economically is largely as a hidden tax, a tax paid not by China, but by American consumers and businesses.
Because it's the U.S. company importing the goods that physically pays the tariff duty at the border.
Precisely. And those costs inevitably get passed down the supply chain. They end up embedded in the final retail price of goods, whether it's electronics, furniture, clothes, you name it.
So tariffs directly fuel inflation.
They absolutely contribute to inflation across the board. And some of the analysts we looked at, they've modeled what would happen if tariffs were escalated further, say, to that 130% level on all Chinese imports that's been floated in some political circles.
Wow, 130%.
Yeah, a huge number. Their estimates suggest the direct cost burden on the average U.S. household could be significant, somewhere in the range of $1,200 to $1,500 extra per year.
That is not small change for most families.
Not at all. That's a real hit to the household budget. It really brings that quote from Dr. Evan Kaplan in the source material to life. He said, "You can't run a Walmart economy with Cold War trade policies." Meaning, the entire U.S. consumer economy, for better or worse, has been built over decades on these highly efficient, low-cost, globalized supply chains, many running through China. You can't just slap massive punitive taxes onto those chains without causing major economic disruption and pain back home. It's structurally incompatible.
So the administration, any administration really, gets caught in a bind.
Totally caught.
Yeah.
Because tariffs are often politically popular, right? They play well as a symbol of being tough on China, which satisfies a certain domestic political narrative.
Sure.
But if you pile the direct cost of those tariffs onto the potential shortages and price spikes caused by China hitting back with things like rare earth controls, well, the public backlash against the resulting inflation and scarcity could become really fierce.
So it becomes a choice between political signaling and economic stability.
That's the tightrope they have to walk.
And just as these economic tensions are ramping up, this whole strategy is facing a potential existential challenge from a completely different direction.
Yeah.
The courts, the trade war, is literally running into the U.S. Constitution.
Yeah, this is where the story takes a really fascinating legal turn. There's a major constitutional challenge focused on the legality of those original Trump-era tariffs, and it's steadily making its way towards the Supreme Court. And significantly, two separate lower federal courts have already ruled against the government, saying the president exceeded his authority.
Okay, what's the core legal issue here? It centers on that emergency powers law, IEEPA, right?
That's right. The International Emergency Economic Powers Act. IEPA gives the president really broad powers to regulate international economic activity, but crucially, only during a declared national emergency related to an unusual and extraordinary threat from abroad.
And presidents have used it for decades, haven't they? For sanctions.
Absolutely. Administrations from Carter onwards have used IEPA routinely and generally without successful legal challenge to impose targeted sanctions. Think sanctions against Iran, North Korea, specific terrorist groups, Russian oligarchs after Ukraine, illicit financial networks. That's seen as its proper intended use targeted emergency actions.
Okay, so why is using IEEPA for these broad China tariffs suddenly being questioned by the courts? What makes this different?
The argument being made by the plaintiffs, who are mostly U.S. importers, companies who actually pay the tariffs, is that the president used IEPA not for a targeted temporary emergency measure, but to impose broad, generalized, long-lasting taxes, because that's what tariffs effectively are on imports from a major global economy, not some small rogue state. And they argue this fundamentally reshapes U.S. trade policy as a whole.
And imposing taxes, or duties, that power belongs specifically to Congress under Article 1 of the Constitution, the power of the purse.
That is the absolute core of their argument. They're saying the executive branch can't just declare a broad, ongoing emergency about trade deficits or competition and then use that declaration to unilaterally bypass Congress and levy what amount to massive inflationary taxes on American consumers and businesses. The lower courts agreed. One ruling stated quite forcefully, emergency powers are not a substitute for Congress.
And the Federal Circuit Court upheld that. So the implications here, if the Supreme Court agrees, they're potentially huge.
Oh, enormous. If the Supreme Court upholds those lower court rulings, and a decision could potentially come as early as March 2026, though timing is always uncertain, it would fundamentally redraw the lines of power. It would significantly curtail the president's ability to wage these kinds of broad, unilateral trade wars based on emergency declarations.
It introduces massive legal uncertainty around one of the main tools the U.S. has been using.
Exactly. It could force trade policy decisions back towards Congress, requiring legislation, requiring negotiation, making it slower, more deliberative, more aligned with traditional rules-based trade approaches. It takes away that unilateral executive hammer.
And you can bet Beijing is watching this legal case very, very closely.
Absolutely. A Supreme Court ruling against the president's tariff authority would be a huge signal to China. It would suggest that Washington's economic arsenal is legally constrained, subject to domestic political battles, judicial review, maybe not as reliable or swift as they thought. That uncertainty itself becomes a strategic factor.
So, in a weird twist, the Supreme Court might end up being the force that pushes U.S. policy away from tariffs, which hurt U.S. consumers anyway, and forces a focus on the much harder, slower work.
Potentially. The harder work of actual innovation, serious domestic investment in things like refining, and building genuine, resilient supply chains with allies. It might force a shift from punitive measures to constructive long-term strategy.
Okay, let's pull the lens back again and look at China's longer-term strategy here. We talked about the internal drivers shoring up legitimacy, hedging against the dollar, forcing their own tech independence. But these moves, especially the mineral controls, they send massive shockwaves out to U.S. allies too, right?
Oh, the panic is definitely global. And it's probably most intense in countries that have already had a taste of this medicine. You look at Japan.
Right.
They import almost all of their rare earths historically from China. And they got hit with a really painful supply cutoff back in 2010. It was during a dispute over those islands, the Senkaku-Ryukyu Islands.
I remember that. It was a real wake-up call.
It wasn't theoretical for them. It was recent, painful operational history. They learned the hard way what weaponized supply chains feel like.
So that 2010 incident, it was like a strategic trauma for Tokyo. It forced them to start acting much earlier than maybe the U.S. or Europe.
Absolutely. Japan's response since then has been really multi-pronged. They invested heavily in R&D for recycling rare earths from old electronics, so-called urban mining. Yeah. And they've actively funded and partnered with non-Chinese mining and processing operations, most notably with Australia's Lynas Corporation, helping them get established. But even with all that effort over more than a decade now, the analysts we looked at still estimate it'll take Japan another 5 to 7 years minimum to truly insulate its key supply chains. The refining bottleneck is just that persistent.
And Europe. They're caught right in the middle, too, especially with their huge manufacturing sectors. German automakers, French aerospace, and defense.
Exactly. They face the same deep reliance on Chinese refined inputs for critical components. The European Union definitely recognized this as an existential vulnerability, especially as they try to push forward with their ambitious Green Deal initiative.
Which needs a ton of magnets for wind turbines and EVs.
A massive amount. So they formally designated rare earths and other materials as critical raw materials, and they passed their own landmark legislation, the Rare Earths Act.
What's the goal of that act? What are they trying to achieve?
The EU set some pretty ambitious targets. They want to source 10% of their annual rare earth demand from mining within the EU, and crucially, process 40% of their demand domestically, all by 2030.
That's a huge shift.
It is. It shows they fundamentally understand that relying on a single, potentially adversarial external supplier for something as basic as a magnet is a massive national security risk in the 21st century. But it also means committing huge amounts of public and private money to try and resurrect a heavy, complex, and frankly toxic industry that Europe, like the U.S., deliberately offshored decades ago. It's a U-turn.
So, okay, we know the raw resources exist outside China. We have allies like Australia, Canada, who are rich of these minerals, but it always comes back to the processing, the refining capacity. Can allies like Australia and Canada actually step up fast enough to make a real difference?
Well, they certainly have the rocks in the ground, the geological potential, and companies like Lynas in Australia or Vital Metals operating in Canada and elsewhere, they are definitely making progress, often with government backing now. But, as Professor Martin Devereaux noted in one source, while you can maybe speed up digging the ore out of the ground, you can't really speed up the complex chemistry of separation and refining that much. And you can't instantly build the massive, capital-intensive processing plants.
Right.
So the reality is, even with those efforts, total non-Chinese refining capacity today is still shockingly low. It meets less than 15% of global demand. Building new plants takes years, requires huge capital investment, faces tough environmental permitting hurdles, and you need to train a whole new generation of specialized engineers and chemists. That bottleneck isn't going away overnight. It persists for years, maybe a decade or more.
And while the West is grappling with permits, funding, finding skilled workers, legal challenges, China isn't standing still. They're actively working to secure their future supplies globally.
This is the next phase of their global strategy, it seems. They are systematically locking up long-term supply agreements and investing in mining projects across Africa and Latin America. It's like a rare earth belt and road initiative.
Where specifically?
We see major Chinese investments and agreements being signed in places like Tanzania, which has huge undeveloped rare earth potential. Also Bolivia for lithium, Myanmar for heavy rare earths. They are proactively securing the feedstock for their refineries for decades to come.
It really does sound like the 21st century version of the 20th century scramble for oil control.
That's exactly the framing used by Dr. Ananya Krishnan, the energy geoeconomist quoted in our sources. Her line was stark. Whoever controls the inputs controls the future. China isn't just trying to protect its current dominance, it's trying to ensure it maintains leverage over the essential materials for the next wave of industrial and military technology, even as the West frantically tries to build its own capacity. They're playing the long game.
You know, Jake Sullivan, the U.S. National Security Advisor, he talks about the goal not being full decoupling, which everyone admits is basically impossible and probably undesirable, but de-risking, reducing dependency. But based on these timelines you're laying out, the clock really seems to be ticking in China's favor, doesn't it?
The timeline issue is perhaps China's single greatest structural advantage in this competition. Think about it. Building a brand new, large-scale rare earth mine from the first geological survey to full, stable production, that typically takes a decade, maybe longer with permitting fights.
A decade.
And training the highly specialized workforce needed the metallurgists, the chemical engineers, who understand the intricacies of solvent extraction for 17 different elements. That takes a generation. Universities need to restart programs, students need to enroll, they need years of hands-on experience.
So the West is playing catch-up from way behind.
Years behind, perhaps a decade or more in terms of scaled industrial capacity for refining. It's a monumental task, requiring sustained bipartisan political will and enormous financial investment over decades, not just a few years. This deep dependency we have, it isn't just a temporary hiccup we can fix with a few quick policies. It's become the new, uncomfortable, structural reality of global power. Hashtag outro.
Wow. Okay, so this deep dive, it really brings us right back to where we started, doesn't it? That core concept of mutually assured disruption.
Hmm.
We've pretty clearly established, I think, that both Washington and Beijing now hold these powerful levers capable of seriously crippling the other side's industrial base. One side controls the high-end chips, the brains.
And the other controls the foundational materials, the building blocks.
But the catch is, neither side can really win this economic fight in any traditional sense without inflicting terrible, self-damaging wounds in the process.
That really is the defining feature of this cold peace that we seem to be entering. The economic pain we're seeing, the inflation from tariffs, the potential shortages from export controls, the huge costs of building redundant supply chains. It's deeply uncomfortable, but maybe. Maybe it's the modern form of deterrence.
A way to compete fiercely without actually going to war.
Exactly. It's a mechanism to exert power, to signal resolve, to fight for advantage, but without crossing that final catastrophic line into kinetic conflict. Economic pain is, well, painful, but it's ultimately reversible in ways that war is not.
And all our sources, they kept coming back to that idea from Thucydides, that the trap isn't just about rising and falling powers. It's fundamentally shaped by fear.
Yes. Fear of losing status, fear of becoming dependent, fear of the unknown consequences of confrontation.
And that really leaves us, and leaves you listening, with the critical question, doesn't it? For the U.S., can Washington manage to transform that very real, very acute fear, the fear of supply chain vulnerability, the public fear of inflation? Can that fear be channeled into a coherent, truly national long-term strategy?
Can the U.S. actually launch what some have called a supply chain Manhattan Project? Something that requires focus, resources, and transcends the usual political squabbling, lasting not just one administration, but for decades.
Because the alternative seems to be this escalating cycle of economic confrontation, coupled with this profound legal uncertainty we discussed hanging over the president's main economic weapons.
Yeah.
And that combination feels like it could eventually give way to something far more dangerous.
It's a precarious balance.
So the final thought maybe is this. If real strategic power in this century, if supply chain sovereignty is as rare and costly to achieve as these minerals are to refine, just how high a price are American consumers and voters actually willing to pay for that security? That willingness or lack thereof might ultimately determine the outcome of this new economic war far more than any single tariff or export ban.